Hello everybody and welcome to the January tier list for Command & Conquer Rivals. Even though we haven't had a patch since the last tier list, it has become apparent how incredibly busted the Shade is, and people have started using it on ladder more, so it has impacted the metagame. As people have adapted to the rise in Shade and Razorback, the metagame has changed, so I did feel like another tier list was appropriate. So yeah, let's take a look at the new tier list. So first thing we're going to look at is what the definitions mean. So it's the same as before. We've got S tier is God tier, it's probably too strong, like needs a nerf. A tier is the really strong units. B is good units. C playable, but you probably shouldn't play them in this current metagame. And D is just like absolutely terrible. I really would basically never play these units except out maybe a very specific role player, but generally speaking, I wouldn't play them. Alright, so first let's take a look at the commander list. Here is the commander list from December, and then here is the January commander list. So not much has changed on this front. Seth is down a little bit. Seth is really just an A tier commander. I wouldn't put him in S at all. He doesn't feel broken right now at all. He's just a strong commander. He is also the best commander for the Shade deck, which is why he's up there in A tier. Oksana is basically the commander of choice for all other decks. If you're not playing a Seth deck, you generally play Oksana. Jade is down to C now. That's because Jade doesn't have the broken base kill anymore. You now need chem units to do it. It's still a valid strategy. People still play Jade with chems, but that's now the only thing Jade does, is trying to kill a base with a chem warrior. So it's not as good as it used to be. Kayn is still complete trash in D. Solomon's still in B, thanks to the buff, and the damage done to base being bugged. So he's like, that's a valid strategy, is to base kill like Jade used to be. So Solomon's in B. Jackson's still in B. I'm not sure about this one. Jackson could definitely be in C, but I think his role player as a booster for Mammoth tanks and Zone Trooper decks is still too important. So he's still in B tier just about, but he's close to being C at this point, I think. And Liang is obviously right on the edge of S tier, would be higher if there was higher. The most recent nerf, in air quotes, that made him 10 cost cheaper was just completely insane. Yeah, Liang is just easily the best commander in the game. It's not remotely close. He's overpowered for sure. I can't believe they haven't nerfed him yet. I guess they meant to nerf him and they got it wrong, so whatever. Anyway, let's move on to the units now. So here is the December nod, and then here is January nod. So first things first, the Shade is completely busted. It would be in a higher tier if there was one, but there's only S tier. I've put a plus on it, even though it hasn't moved tier, just to indicate how busted this thing is. This is definitely the most overpowered unit that's ever existed in Rivals. It's completely off the grid, broken. Not a lot to be said there. So basically, as you can see, Nod at the moment is basically just a wall of C tier units. So the reason for this is that the metagame has narrowed so heavily down to just Shade and Razorback. Those are the only two decks that really see any tournament play if they're not banned, because they're just better than everything else. Like, those two units are completely dominant, and those decks are dominant. So anything that is not good versus either the Razorback decks or the Shade decks is just not a good choice to play anymore. So that's why you see Giga is now in C, Buggy, Banshee, Laser Drones, these are all in C now. The reason for this is that these units just aren't good against the Razorback or the Shade deck. Giga does nothing against Razorback or Shade decks because they're primarily air-based. Buggy, which should be good, is just garbage because it loses 1v1 to a Razorback somehow, because Razorback is so overpowered, and it just gets insta-gibbed by the Shade. So even though Buggy is in a metagame where it technically should be quite good, the units are just so overpowered that it's not close, and so that's way down. Banshee is down because, again, even though it seems like it should be good in this metagame because it's an air-to-air unit, everyone is playing Phantom in Nod or Stealth Tank now. So everyone has something that will one-shot your Banshees, and Banshees are expensive at 60 Tiberium, so getting them one-shot is horrendous. And all of the GDI decks have, like, powerful anti-air units to support their air plan. So we're talking, like, Zone Trooper, Sandstorm, Slingshot, something like that. Something that makes the Banshee terrible. So Banshee actually thrives much better in a War Factory metagame where it's a good splash unit and people aren't focusing as heavily on anti-air. Because everyone's playing air, everyone is playing super strong anti-air, so the Banshee just completely falls apart. And that's why the Banshee is down in C tier, even though it is still an okay unit. It just, in this metagame, it's just keep getting one shot all the time or shut out by slingshots. So yeah, Banshee's way down. The reason laser drones are in C tier isn't a power level thing. It's the fact that there's no reason to ever play laser drones over Shade. Like, they're in C tier because you should always play Shade over laser drones. The only reason not to play Shade is that you don't want to contribute to Shade being in the metagame. But if you want to win, you should always play Shade over laser drones. So there's no reason to play laser drones. So laser drones are way down in C tier, even though they're still a pretty good unit. There's just no reason to use them. We've got some other stuff going down to D tier. Artillery's in D tier for the same reason that Giga got moved to C tier. It's just not good in this air-based metagame to have a ground pounder unit like that. It's so bad versus Shade as well. Even Razorbacks, I've literally had artillery killed by Razorbacks. So, yeah, artillery's not looking good right now. Confessor has got the same problem as Buggy. It should be good in this metagame because it's an air metagame, but it just isn't strong enough versus the things that kill it. It dies to Razorbacks, and it dies pretty easily to Venoms. Like, not 1v1, but for its cost, it's not very effective against those things. So, yeah, it's kind of underwhelming, even though it should be good in this metagame. And Cyborg, I've moved down to D tier. This one I'm not sure about. But the reason I put Cyborg in D tier is that it's just so bad versus Razorbacks. Zone Troopers can actually kind of fight Razorbacks a little bit, but Cyborgs just get crushed by them. And they're not even good versus, like, Militants and so on. And they're more expensive than Zone Troopers, which has always baffled me. So basically, A and B tier now is just units that you can use in the Shade Razorback metagame. So obviously Militants go in the Shade deck, Chems go in the Shady Jade deck. Wheels are in A tier for the same reason as Fanatics and Stealth Tank, which is that the only other Nod deck you can play that isn't Shade is Fanatics with Stealth Tank, and then you have to play Wheels and Fanatics and Stealth Tank, and that's good versus the Razorback decks, but is terrible versus the Shade decks. So those units are still in A tier just because of their effectiveness versus GDI and Razorback in particular. If it was a Nod mirror, those units would all be probably in like C or D tier because they're just all so bad against the Shade deck. Bikes are in the A tier still. They're terrible against Shade as well, but they're really critical for fighting Talons with the Shade deck, so they're still in A tier. And then B tier is obviously like lasers are just a core unit. Everyone has to play lasers, but they're not actually that amazing, so they're in B. Mutants live long enough against Razorback for you to actually stand a chance of killing things like slingshots and using your phantoms, so they just about sneak into B, but they're on the cusp. They could be C. Inferno's in B because it's an air unit, so it manages to dodge most of the hate of the metagame and still be useful. And Chuggy is in B again because of its effectiveness against the Razorback deck. Chuggy is actually quite good against Razorback deck because you can kill the missiles without the Razorback stopping you. It's completely useless against the Shade deck again. So yeah, as the metagame has narrowed, the number of playable units has obviously reduced dramatically because everything is based around these two decks, the Shade and the Razorback deck. So if your units aren't good versus those, they're not very good, which is why so many units are now down in C and D tier. So when people say things like everyone can play Shade, so it doesn't really matter that it's overpowered, this is the issue with that argument. Everyone can play Shade, but if you want to play anything else, you're out of luck because they're all just terrible in this metagame. So that's the issue with Shade or Razorback being overpowered, really, even though everyone can play them and it's not like unfair or whatever. The problem is that if you want to play anything else, you're out of luck. You just have to play those things. Anyway, rant about the Shade over. Let's move on to GDI. So here you can see December GDI, and here is January GDI. So not much has changed for GDI. Yeah, the main change you'll see here is Zone Troopers have gone from C to A. This is because they are fantastic against the Shade deck. The Shade deck's like biggest weakness in the game, I think, is the two biggest weaknesses are Talon and Zone Trooper. Those are the two things it struggles with the most. Zone Troopers are actually really, really difficult for that deck to deal with because they beat up Militants so easily, and it's easy to support them with an anti-infantry unit. So they are in A. They're also okay versus Razorbacks, but not great. So they are definitely a playable unit, but it's mostly their prowess against the Shade deck that's put them back in A. I think putting them in C was an overreaction anyway. They probably should have been B, but last month's metagame pre-Shade was all about the Razorback deck, and zones just weren't good. Like, Sandstorm was way better, so that's why I put the zones into that category. So you can also see here that we've got the Sandstorm up in A. That's because of it's so good versus the Razorback deck. That's why Sandstorm's up there with Zone Trooper. But that's not a change. That was the same last month. And then let's take a look at what's gone down. So the reason I've put these things down is that I was getting to a point where quite a lot of the units were sitting in A tier for me for GDI, and I figured if that many units are A tier, a lot of them should probably, like the weaker ones out of that selection should probably just be B tier, because B tier is still good units. B tier is like well balanced, good units. A tier is the ones that are like really strong. So that's the reason that I've got rifles, drones, and Orca and APC all down in B tier now. It's not because those units are bad, it's just because they are weaker than the other options available. So currently I think dogs are a lot better than rifles. I think they're really strong right now. I'm not saying any deck that plays rifles should be playing dogs instead. Obviously there are decks that want the rifle missile combo like the Razorback deck does. But generally speaking, I think anyone who opens barracks is going to be unfavored versus dogs. Whereas you're going to be in a mirror if you open with riflemen. So I think the dogs are a lot better. So I've put riflemen down to B tier. This is maybe controversial. They're still a good unit. B tier is still good units. But yeah, I think they're B tier now. The same is true with Drone Swarm. I just don't think Drone Swarm's really that worth playing anymore. Talon is so good in this metagame because of all the air-to-air power. Like being cheap and having air-to-air is so useful. And Razorback is just so much better than Drone Swarm. I don't think there's really much reason to play Drone Swarm most of the time. It's really just a stall unit for tech decks. So that's gone down to B tier. The Orca I've also put in B tier now. Again, same reasoning. The unit is fine. I just think that Mohawk and Borka are often a better choice. So that's why it's down in B tier. Still a fine unit. Just I don't think it deserves to be in A tier like it did. I think generally people have refined their decks and are moving towards the Mohawk or the Borka instead. APC is also down a tier. This is, again, just the metagame right now. The APC is not very good against the Razorback or the Shade deck. It goes down quite quickly to Shades, and it's not that efficient against the Razorback decks, and Orca Bomber is also seeing a lot of play. So I think the APCs are weaker than it used to be. The only other notable change is Predator is down to C tier. This is just because we're in such an air metagame now. Shade is popular as well. The Predator tank just isn't really doing much work. The only job it really has at the moment is killing pit bulls. Other than that, it really doesn't see much play. And I'd also like to make a quick mention of the MLRS. The only reason this is still in B tier is because you can combo it with a slingshot, and this can actually protect it from the air metagame a little bit, which the Giga doesn't have a counterpart to help it out, so that's why Giga got bumped down, but MLRS didn't. Yeah, so I think that's basically everything. We haven't had a balance patch, so not much has changed apart from the Shade entering the metagame. And the Shade entering the metagame, the main thing it's done is hose Nod units. So that's why Nod has a lot of units that have dropped off in power level, whereas GDI is pretty much sitting in the same place as it was before, with just a notable exception of that Zone Trooper getting picked up back up to A tier. Alright guys, hope you all enjoyed that, and yeah, I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments what you agree and disagree with. Before you tell me I'm an idiot for putting stuff in B tier, like Rifleman, don't forget that B tier is still good units. B tier is good, balanced units, just not very, very strong units. So, yeah, that's why Rifleman is in B and not A anymore. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.